I get a lot of comments from people saying that retiring early is something that only rich people can dream of, that it's not a reality for normal people earning average wages. I know that finances are tight for a lot of us right now, and it's hard to be optimistic about the future, but I completely disagree with that statement. The average age of retirement in the UK is 65 years old. And in this video, I'm going to show you how, by following some really simple steps, it's entirely possible for someone who earns an average wage or even less than that to comfortably retire years earlier. Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, my name is James. I am a financial planner, and this is a place where you can learn to make smarter financial decisions. A lot of my content is targeted at those that have higher than average incomes, not only because it's where my experience lies, but also because the more you earn, the more complex financial planning becomes. Because of this, people often comment on my videos saying, this is all good and well for high earners, but what are people who earn less supposed to do? Well, the answer is exactly the same. Whether you earn £20,000 per year or £200,000, the principles and strategies you should be using to build wealth and retire are exactly the same. Saving on autopilot, pensions, index funds, and compound growth. I talk about these things in every single one of my videos. These are not tools that are only available to rich people. They're available to everyone, and I'm going to show you how you can use them to build wealth and retire early, and to start feeling much more optimistic about the future. Of course, the less you earn, the less you're likely to be able to save, but you're also likely to have a lower cost of living than someone who earns more, and as a result, need less income to sustain your quality of life in retirement. I'm going to start by showing you what it takes for someone who earns the average UK wage to retire early with a comfortable lifestyle. Then we'll look at examples of what it takes for people who earn less than that. The first thing we need to understand is what is the average wage in the UK. According to the ONS, as of April 2023, the median wage for someone in full-time employment is £14,000 for those aged 16 to 17. This goes up to £22,000 for those aged 18 to 21, then peaks at £40,000 between 40 and 49 before declining as we get into the 50s and 60s. This is the lifetime earnings trajectory for the average person in the UK. In the UK, we have a law that requires employers to automatically enroll their staff into a workplace pension, meaning that if you're employed and you have not opted out, at a minimum, you will be contributing 5% of your salary into a pension each month, and your employer will be contributing 3%. So that's 8% of your salary going in each month, and you probably don't even notice. If you're self-employed, this won't happen automatically. You will need to set up your own pension, but it's relatively simple and can be very tax efficient. The first question we want to answer is, when might someone with the average wage trajectory be able to retire if they are just saving the default 8% into their pension each month? To answer this, we're going to need to make some assumptions. Let's say you started work at 20 years old. At 20, you will not automatically be opted into your workplace pension. Up until the age of 22, you have to choose to opt in. But let's say that you do, and you start earning the average wage of 22k per year, meaning that you'll be saving £153 per month or £1,880 per year into your pension. If your income then follows the average trajectory, you'll start to pay more into the pension as you get older, meaning that by 55, so after 35 years, you would have saved £103,000 in today's money into your pension. But the money in your pension is not going to be sitting as cash. It will be invested in the stock market and grow over time. Your pension provider will automatically invest your money into a default investment fund, unless you've logged into your pension and made your own investment choices. With these defined contribution pensions, you are the one that is ultimately responsible for how your pension is invested. And by making use of a SIP, it's possible to invest in pretty much anything you want. Since 1975, the global stock market, as defined by the MSCI World Index, has delivered an average annual return of 11.2% per year. That's not a cherry-picked date, it's just as far back as the data goes on my analytics software. And I've chosen this index because it's the longest running global index. You can invest your pension into a fund that tracks this index or a similar global stock market index, and it will invest your money into thousands of businesses from across the world. It's not trying to be clever by selecting good companies to invest in. Instead, it tries to invest in as many companies as possible to give you the average return of the stock market. This is the simplest way to invest. However, with these funds, you're likely to pay fees. So if we assume fees of 0.5%, that brings the annual return down to 10.7% per year. This is, of course, looking back into the past. There is no guarantee that we will see similar returns in the future, but for the sake of this example, if we assumed you invested your pension into a similar fund and achieved this return, by the age of 35, you'd be projected to have £100,000 in your pension. That's 15 years to get to 100k. But by 41, so only 6 years later, you'd have 200k. And then the next 100k would only take 4 years, then 3 years, then 2 years, until you would be projected to have £947,000 in your pension at the age of 55. For the first decade, it might seem like you're not making any progress. It takes 15 years to get to the first 100k, but by the end, it's growing at almost 100 grand a year. That is the power of compound growth for you. It's pretty cool, right? And that's just by contributing the default 8% per year into your pension that you're probably already doing. But before you click away thinking that your retirement plans are sorted, hold on a second, because there's a few problems with this example. Firstly, many of you are probably scratching your head thinking, my pension has not achieved returns anywhere near this. In fact, most people will not have because their pensions are not invested correctly. And later on in the video, I'm going to show you how you can fix this. Secondly, although £900,000 sounds like a lot of money today, in 35 years' time, it's going to be worth a lot less because inflation will have eroded its value. And thirdly, although a 10% annual return sounds great, it masks the fact that the journey to achieve that return has been very volatile. Some years the stock market has been up 20%, others it's been down 40%, and not everyone has the stomach for that. The investment return that we assume in our example is the most important variable. So to help us make a better assumption, let's look at some historical data that has already taken inflation into account. Each line here represents an investment portfolio that comprises a different combination of global stocks and bonds. These are simple portfolios created from generic stock and bond indexes. It's nothing fancy, and I've left a link down in the description to the source of this data so you can see what's in them. I use this data with all of my clients to help them understand the risk and return trade-offs of different types of investments. In the second column, we have the annualized real return. So that's the return after deducting inflation that each portfolio has delivered over the last 50 years. Obviously, everyone wants the highest returns, right? And as you can see, the more exposure a portfolio has to stocks, the higher its return tends to be. But what you'll also notice is that the more stock exposure you have, the more painful it's likely to be in the short term. Bigger drops in value that happen more often and take longer to recover from. If you're a long way from retirement and you can't even access your pension for decades, these drops in value shouldn't be too much of a concern. But for many people, especially those that are closer to retirement, a 100% stock portfolio is not likely to be appropriate. So for our assumptions, let's look at a more moderate 60-40 portfolio. This data does not include fees. So again, let's assume a 0.5% fee, which gives us a 6.1% annual real return. Again, this is what has happened in the past. There is no guarantee that we will see returns like this in the future. So to be conservative, for our forward-looking estimates, let's assume a 5% annual real return. And if we rerun our numbers with this assumption, you would be projected to have £265,000 in your pension at age 55. It's not as exciting as 900k, but we're assuming a more conservative investment, and that's 265 grand in today's money. The next question is, what type of lifestyle could that afford you in retirement? Well, that depends on how old you are. At the time of recording, you can access the money in your pension once you turn 55, but that is set to increase to 57 from 2028, and it may go even higher in the future. We have to pick something here, so let's assume you have to work 2 more years until 57 to be able to access your pension, at which point it's projected to be worth 300 grand. To work out what type of lifestyle this could afford, we're going to need to make some more assumptions. Let's assume you keep the pension invested in the same portfolio with the same fees, assume that you qualify for a full state pension, and according to the ONS, a 57-year-old male has a 25% chance of living to 92. But to be conservative, let's assume you live to 95. Then we're going to plug this data into some software that I often use with clients to stress test retirement plans against historical stock market and inflation data, which tells us that based on our assumptions, an expenditure of £19,000 per year adjusted for inflation throughout retirement would have been sustainable in 90% of historical scenarios, meaning that in 10% of scenarios, you would have needed to reduce your spending to avoid running out of money. If you didn't do that, In the worst case scenario, which would have happened if you'd retired in January 1969, you would have depleted your pension assets by 67. But in 90% of scenarios, you would have had money left over at the end. I love this perspective because it shows you just how variable stock market returns have been. In 10% of scenarios, you would have run out of money. But in the median scenario, you would have ended up with about the same amount that you started with in today's terms. Whereas in some situations, you'd be ending up with even more. In this example, we've assumed that you're going to spend the same amount throughout retirement in real terms. But in reality, it's likely that you're going to vary the amount that you spend each year depending on your needs and how lucky you get with your investment returns. And again, it's important to remember that this is based on what has happened in the past. The future could look very different, but based on the assumptions that we've made, if you earn the average salary, you put the default 8% into your pension and make sure it's invested correctly, you would have had a decent chance of being able to retire at 57 and sustain expenditure of at least £19,000 per year. And that's just with saving the default. In a second, we're going to look at what happens if you save even more than this. But first, what if you're on a lower earnings trajectory than the average? As I said, it's all relative. If you earn 10% less than the average lifetime trajectory, you'll save 10% less over your lifetime, meaning that instead of being projected to end up with £300,000 at 57, you'd be projected to end up with 10% less. Or if you earn 20% less than average, you'd end up with 20% less at retirement. However, that does not translate into a proportional reduction in sustainable retirement expenditure. If we keep all the other variables the same, but say that your pension was valued at £270k at 57, a retirement expenditure of £17,900 per year would have been sustainable in 90% of historical scenarios. That's 5.8% less than the average earner. Or if you earned 20% less and had 240k at 57, expenditure of £16,800 per year would have been sustainable, 11.6% less than the average. This is because at these lower levels, the state pension is going to cover a much larger proportion of your retirement expenditure, meaning that your private pension has to do a lot less of the work. But what if you think these figures look too low and you're hoping to spend more in retirement? Well, firstly, remember that in retirement, your costs are likely to drop significantly. Hopefully, by then you have no mortgage costs, no commuting costs, and your children have left home. Secondly, this is only for one person. If you're in a couple, both earning the same wage, you should double these figures. But if you still think you're going to need more in retirement, you have 4 main options. Number 1, work for longer. Number 2, increase the risk of your portfolio to target higher returns. Number 3, you could downsize. Or number 4, you could save more money. Now, here we're trying to retire early, so working longer isn't an option. And let's say that you don't have the stomach for higher levels of risk, and let's just assume that you want to stay in your own home. So what if, instead of just putting the default into your pension, you increased your contributions from 5% of your salary to 10%? So that including your employer contribution, you now have 13% of your salary each month going in. Some employers may even match your higher contributions, which would effectively double your money. But for our example, let's assume that that is not on offer. Although you're putting 5% more of your salary into your pension, assuming that your employer uses a salary sacrifice pension, this would only reduce your take-home pay by roughly 3.6% because you'll also be paying less income tax and national insurance. So if you did this, where would you be at 57? Again, it's all relative. We've gone from saving 8% of our salary to 13%. That's 1.6 times more. So you'd expect to end up with 1.6 times more at retirement. Then if we plug this into our software with the same assumptions as before, it tells us that in 90% of historical scenarios, expenditure of £25,600 would have been sustainable. So you've given up 3.6% of your take-home pay for a 35% boost in retirement income. And by the way, the average take-home pay for a 60-year-old in full-time work is £26,500. So unless you're expecting your costs to go up in retirement, this should be more than enough. Saving on autopilot, pensions, index funds, and compound growth. These are the tools that are available for everyone to build wealth and retire with confidence. If you're watching this video and you're 20 years old, well, you're very lucky to have learnt this stuff at such a young age. And I really hope that you make the most of this opportunity to start early. But I know that most of you will be learning these things at a much later stage in life. So yes, there is bound to be some catching up to do, but that's Totally normal. Most people don't wake up to this stuff until later on in life. And the good news is that if you're employed and you haven't opted out of your pension, you will already have been saving a decent chunk into it each month. So the most important thing that you can do right now is to make sure that your money is invested correctly. Because if it's not, you may as well ignore this entire video. The most sensitive variable in our example is the rate of investment return that we assume. And if you don't know how your money is invested or what fees that you're being charged, it's unlikely you will see returns like this, which is why you now need to watch this video here, where I take you through everything that you need to know to sort out your pensions once and for all. I'll see you there.